current U.S. election campaign, that how does South Asia figure in it? Is this a significant issue? Is it a significant region? Is it a source of concern or a land of opportunity?
If there's any part of South Asia that's becoming a part of this campaign, it's Afghanistan. The Biden administration in particular has not wanted to talk about it, I think, because it's become a political liability, given that the last few weeks of the withdrawal were so chaotic and indeed deadly. But that's why it's become a part of the campaign, in that Donald Trump has repeatedly brought it up and used it as a point to criticize first Biden on and then Harris on. However, as you know, you have pretty large South Asian diasporas in the U.S., particularly the Indian American community. The Pakistani diaspora is actually one of the fastest growing Asian diasporas in this country. You also have a Bangladesh diaspora that's growing. So I do think that from the perspective of constituent politics, South Asia is important, but that doesn't mean that it's going to be high on the radar of the campaign. And as I said before, to the extent that South Asia features in the campaign, it's really Afghanistan. For there to be a presidential candidate that's an Indian American, obviously that's a huge thing. And if you were to win the election, would be obviously something with major implications for India.
You mentioned Afghanistan. How it is playing out in the campaign discourse of both parties?
Both Donald Trump and Joe Biden badly wanted to get out of Afghanistan. That's very clear. Biden had been, a holdout when he was VP in the Biden administration, in the Obama administration. He opposed the troop surge. He never wanted that to happen.
Yes.
And those views continued. Trump, of course, we know, wanted to get out for a long time as well. But, there were many when Biden decided to essentially complete when he decided to abide by the Doha deal that was signed by the Trump administration, and President Biden owned that decision to leave Afghanistan, there were many Democrats that didn't agree with him. There were many Republicans that did agree with him. So it's not something that's played out along partisan lines, but in the election campaign now, it's definitely become a partisan issue, in that Donald Trump and many Republicans have really been hitting the Democrats hard for that chaotic withdrawal.
When we witnessed the recent statements by the State Department, the recent visits by the Pentagon leadership to South Asia, we notice a degree of concern in Washington, in Tampa, regarding the rise of terrorism in Afghanistan. And I notice a degree of convergence of this mutual concern in Islamabad, in Pindi, in Washington, and in other power centers in the U.S.
From Pakistan's perspective, TTP is the biggest concern, the biggest terrorist concern emanating from Afghanistan, for good reason. But here in Washington, the focus is very narrow, and it tends to be focused on ISKP. I mean, TTP is a group that previously posed a threat to the U.S. Of course, you had a TTP-trained militant that tried to blow up Times Square almost 15 years ago. But TTP is rebranded now, and its fight is exclusively focused on Pakistan. Perhaps the U.S. indirectly sees the Taliban as a counterterrorism partner, even though there's no known collaborations between the two. But the U.S. view, the U.S. government view, and this would be my view as well, is that even though the Taliban has perhaps been able to keep Islamic State at bay in Afghanistan, the group continues to have a growing capacity to project a threat well beyond Afghanistan.
When we look at the current situation in Afghanistan, briefly, how do you look at the last 3 years of the Taliban administration? Because the perception in Pakistan is that they have not really lived up to their commitments as per the Doha Accord. They have failed to form an inclusive government. Their consideration or towards human rights record is also not very forthcoming, and their ability to eliminate terrorist outfits from their territory, which are attacking other countries, including Pakistan, is less than impressive.
What the Doha deal did do is that it obligated Afghanistan's Taliban essentially to deny space to any type of actor that could pose a threat to the U.S. and its allies. And if you consider Pakistan to be an ally of the U.S., then I would suggest that the TTP should have been a group curbed by the Taliban. And the Taliban have clearly not curbed TTP, or at least not sufficiently, that does not pose a threat to Pakistan. It clearly does. But I think that it's quite clear that the Taliban have not lived up to their obligations.
When you look at the Pakistani perspective, we see three types of terrorist organizations operating from Afghanistan against Pakistan. One is, again, Daesh or ISKP, which has a global agenda. Then there are ethnocentric organizations like BLA, BLF, which are attacking Balochistan. And then there is TTP. What is your view that against which organization there is space and opportunity for Washington and Pakistan to cooperate further?
Well, I mean, I theoretically, all of them, in the sense that the U.S. and Pakistan see eye to eye. As you'll recall, some years ago, the U.S. designated the BLA as a terrorist organization. The State Department did. So that formally put them on the U.S. and Pakistan on the same page. Both countries view all these groups you mentioned as threats and as terrorist organizations. I think that, quite frankly, though, ISKP is the one where there's the potential for the most convergence between the U.S. and Pakistan, because it's really the only group that both see as a major threat. Well, of course, Pakistan would view TTP or the BLA and its ilk as greater threat than ISKP, because, I think it's quite clear that those other groups have been more potent and active in Pakistan than ISKP is, not to minimize the threat that ISKP poses to Pakistan as well.
I want your brief comment on the nature of economic and business cooperation between Pakistan and the US. US is, again, the largest export market for Pakistan, and its role and influence in multilateral economic and financial institutions is also very important for Pakistan. How do you look at the prospects of improving relations for the common economic benefit of both countries?
Come January, it's going to be a new president, one way or the other. But speaking on how things look now, I think that the current administration genuinely wants to work more with Pakistan on economic issues. But I think it feels its hands are tied because of Pakistan's economic stress. I think that the U.S. is waiting and watching to see what happens with the IMF situation. As of course we all know, there is a staff level deal with the IMF, but waiting to see if it's finalized through executive level authorization. The U.S. really wants to see that IMF deal go through. I think it would feel a bit more reassured about engaging economically, commercially with Pakistan if that new IMF deal is in place. So that certainly is a signpost. What happens with the IMF deal?
We have a new administration in Dhaka, and there were some interesting allegations made by the outgoing former Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina of the U.S. involvement in her unceremonious departure. Any thoughts on that?
Well, it's like deja vu, of course, given that we've heard allegations like this in the Pakistan context as well. Now, I think that, Sheikh Hasina has always been, when she was in power, she strengthened relations with the U.S. The U.S.-Bangladesh relationship actually grew in a big way, economically, strategically, even in terms of defense. But she has always been suspicious of U.S. intentions just because of history. Because of, actual U.S. policies, U.S. support for Pakistan during the 71 war, as well as, the U.S.'s very strong support for Muhammad Yunus, who in recent years had become a bitter rival of Sheikh Hasina. So I think that her view is that the U.S. tends to side with her rivals. So I think that sort of fuels these conspiracies and these perceptions about the U.S. This was an organic, spontaneous mass movement in Bangladesh triggered by a particular issue, job quotas that many people didn't like, and then Bangladesh's Sheikh Hasina's security forces cracked down viciously on peaceful protesters, and that basically turned the country against her. These are internal domestic factors that drove the movement that led to her ouster. There was no outside role, whether the U.S. or China or Pakistan, because as you know, there have been allegations from mainly those in India, but also those loyal to Sheikh Hasina, that it might have been China or that it might have been Pakistan, not just the US, that was behind her ouster. But this was a mass movement. It was a traditional people power movement.